I love Mortal Kombat. It's a genre-bending, sword and sorcery, martial arts, sci-fantasy on a scale with He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, which takes itself just seriously enough. But if I'm being honest, it's the mythology and the characters I love more than the gameplay. And you know what? I don't think I'm alone here. From a structural standpoint, there are far better fighting game franchises, but they don't really do anything for me. I don't have a personal story for you about where I was when I first discovered Street Fighter, but I do have a story about Mortal Kombat. Why Pizza Hut scared me a little in the early 90s. Was it the lighting, the cigarette machines, the loud bullies in the corner tables? There was something very 80s about Pizza Hut back then, and not in a good way. It was more like somebody's basement lounge in the 80s, where they stuck all of their old lamps and furniture near the brick wall. It didn't help that the nearest Pizza Hut back then was in a not-so-great part of town. I always felt on edge there, and I only had the guts to wander around if I had a friend to check out the latest arcade machine with. Enter Mortal Kombat on a bowed screen under dirty glass, locked in a cabinet with understated, pulpy artwork. I loved the gold and green dragons, the rudimentary costumes, the weirdness of it all. It reminded me of the paintings on funhouse walls, usually with pseudo-medieval or Eastern fairy tale characters, Merlin-like wizards and mercenaries with curved swords clenched between their teeth. And I loved the world on screen even more. The digitized actors, the uncomplicated arenas. I wanted to break the glass and dive in. I wanted to run my hands over the red walls of Shang Tsung's throne room. Was that fabric or painted stone? I wanted to run off screen to see the left and right sides of the warrior shrine. I didn't care about the violence, and the blood never interested me. To this day, I couldn't pull off a fatality to save my life. But to be fair, it was Mortal Kombat 2 that hooked me. I can think of two reasons why. The first was the expansion of the backstory. The cutscene at the beginning of the arcade version, which established the Mortal Kombat tournament as a safeguard to prevent the Outworld's Emperor, Shao Kahn, from invading Earthrealm. And then there was the Mortal Kombat 2 player's guide I used to bring everywhere, which told me about the various motivations and relationships of the characters. I started collecting other Mortal Kombat 1 and 2 game guides, spending hours reading about the lore and poring over the bonus comics and character designs. Those books were my Bibles in grade school. I used to look forward to flu season so I could stay home and read about the Shakespearean drama of Shao Kahn, his stepdaughter Kitana, and her evil twin Melina all over again. And here I have to say something about the storytelling and artistic talent of co-creator John Tobias. I wasn't surprised to learn years later when he posted scans of his early story notes and character sketches for Mortal Kombat 1 on Twitter that he based the characters on archetypes. Liu Kang was the obvious hero, which made Johnny Cage the perfect comedic sidekick. Curtis Stryker, reworked into Sonya Blade, was the skeptic, and Raiden was obviously the wise old mentor. The list goes on down to the palette swap hunter and hunted ninjas and the unplayable background herald Princess Kitsune, who became Kitana in the following game. John Tobias wrote and illustrated a limited printing comic book showcasing the story and characters. All things considered, it's aged fairly well. The pacing, the artwork, even the dialogue. Scans of his artwork appeared in the various game guides I collected, and I prefer them greatly to the cold, somewhat blocky 3D renders of characters you'd see in game art in the late 90s and most of the Zeros. His characters are expressive, and there's nothing really in your face or ostentatious about the costumes. They're downplayed, and while some of that was due to budgetary reasons, since they had to digitize the game actors who wore the costumes, I really appreciate the minimal aesthetic. Especially with the female characters in these first two games, there was a mindfulness about their outfits, which sadly didn't persist in future games, especially after Tobias left the series. Another thing I appreciate creatively about the development of the early games was that Midway wanted to create an action game starring Jean-Claude Van Damme, but couldn't afford to, so they just made their own game with an action fantasy theme and ported over the Van Jam influences, as well as obvious parallels to Big Trouble in Little China and Kung Fu. As I stated in my Mighty Max video, I really appreciate projects which pull from a number of creative influences, resulting in something brand new. Shigeru Miyamoto did this with Mario when he couldn't get the rights to a Popeye arcade game, reportedly, and threw in elements of King Kong and, as the series progressed, Journey to the West. But to return to Mortal Kombat's creative side, I watched the new movie with friends recently, and we started talking about how differently our generation, pre-internet millennials, absorb stories in video games than later millennials and Gen Z gamers, especially when it came to fighting games. You got into the story, if you cared, by reading the instruction manuals and game guides, or waiting for each playable character's story card to cycle on screen with the game demo. Due to limitations, the complete story wasn't handed to gamers back then, the way it would be in later installments, but I really liked this. It was a co-creation process. It left me with room to dream. And I loved imagining all of the subplots glossed over by these materials. On the playground at recess, I used to act out the way I imagined Reptile and Jade pursue the renegade Princess Katana in Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. On long car trips, I would try to imagine what Shao Kahn's extermination squads were like and how they killed Johnny Cage. And who was this Shinnok who resurrected Mileena to spy on Shao Kahn? I would have to wait until future games for such questions to be answered, much like the canonical status of the various arcade character endings. Speaking of Mileena, I wanted to speak next about another co-creative process I loved about video games growing up. As mentioned before on this channel, I'm transgender. Being able to play as female characters in video games allowed me to lean into the feminine side of my gender identity in some abstract but important ways. It didn't change my body or the male gender roles I was born into, but it allowed me mentally to imagine what it was like to have a female body and how differently I would be able to interact with the world. I love drawing picture books and comic book stories about Mileena, Jade, and Katana, and also Princess Peach and the women of Mario's world. This was especially fun because there weren't as many static representations of these characters as we have today. And it was also really interesting that the women of Mortal Kombat, especially my favorite character Mileena, became increasingly sexualized the further my generation moved into puberty, which probably wasn't an accident. I'm sure assumptions were made by teachers and family that the femme fatales I idolized in various 90s media represented a so-called healthy male interest in the female body, but that wasn't the case. I'd admired these women before they were overtly sexualized, and the older I got, the more annoyed I became by the way they were depicted, which is somewhat of a synchronicity because through male puberty, I became increasingly annoyed with how nature wanted to depict my body. I wanted long hair like Catwoman, and the female ninjas of Mortal Kombat, and I wanted to dress like the Sanderson sisters for Halloween. So Mortal Kombat fell off my radar for most of middle and high school. It wasn't until my early 20s, after I transitioned to female roles and started writing comic book scripts and fantasy novels of my own, that I started keeping tabs on Mortal Kombat on YouTube. I thought of it as research, but it was also pure enjoyment, catching up with several hours worth of playthroughs and character bios and ending cutscenes and interviews with Ed Boon and others on the various 3D games I missed. For my birthday in 2011, I asked for the upcoming soft reboot of the series. And while most of the female costumes were cringier than ever in a porny, weirdly Disney-ish sort of way, I genuinely enjoyed the experience. I don't have it anymore, but every few years I'll rewatch the story mode in increments on YouTube. And sometimes the following game, which I've never played. And while Mortal Kombat 10 doesn't have as interesting a story as 2011's retelling of the original trilogy, I loved what they did with Mileena, both in terms of character design and story arc, making her the heir of Shao Kahn's empire, who looked like she stepped off of the cover of a sword and sorcery novel. But none of this prepared me for the story mode of Mortal Kombat 11, which I own and have played through. While the arcade ladder and the various single-player features haven't held my attention for long, I think this is the best story mode of a Mortal Kombat game to date. It's well-directed, smartly paced, and thematically, I love how the various factions of characters band together after being galvanized by the threat of Kronika. I also appreciate many of the world-building choices peppered through the narrative, stating that Kronika is a titan, which is higher than an elder god. Cronus was the titan god of Greek mythology who birthed the Olympian pantheon, which eventually supplanted him. And it's this sort of commitment to reappropriating instead of retelling older mythologies that I love about Mortal Kombat storytelling. Kronika is not Cronus, any more than Raiden is Zeus. But like I said, the franchise takes its mythology just seriously enough. Having a time-themed villainess with an on-the-nose name like Kronika is a perfect example of this kind of levity, which is shared by other post-pulp mythologies like He-Man and Power Rangers, where you have villains with names like Stinkor and Goldar. All that being said, I don't know where the future of the franchise will take us, but after seeing Mortal Kombat 11's multiple endings, I'm excited to see how the mythology unfolds. Hey, thanks for hanging out and letting me share my Mortal Kombat stories with you. If you enjoyed my take on the franchise, you might enjoy my other videos on modern mythologies which have influenced me as a storyteller and an occultist. If you resonate with what I'm doing and you'd like to help me continue to bring more videos, you can check out patreon.com/faypage. $2 a month gets you early access to new videos plus my Patreon blog. Between videos, I generally work on patron postcards. Higher tiers get one every month plus a tarot card reading. You'll find some more on my Instagram at FayPageAuthor. A very special thanks to my first patron, Sammy K. Check out her beautiful artwork at Lyria, and I hope to see you all in the new era.
Did you have a good time?